In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a rare Stradivarius violin vanishes from a locked case, and its owner, Mr. Hawthorne, is found unconscious, struck down in his study. As the music festival hums with excitement, suspicion falls on four suspects: a fiery conductor with a hidden agenda, a tearful violinist with dreams of glory, a nervous curator drowning in debt, and a charming collector obsessed with rare treasures. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose gentle demeanor hides a razor-sharp mind. With a single muddy footprint, a whiff of chloroform, and a trail of village whispers, she unravels a web of greed and deception, revealing a cunning thief who staged the perfect crime to complete a secret collection. In just 30 seconds, dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where every clue sings a note of truth. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Stradivarius. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest drawing room. She sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl. Outside, the village bustled with the excitement of the annual music festival, an event that transformed the sleepy hamlet into a haven for musicians and their admirers. This year, the festival promised a spectacle. A rare Stradivarius violin, owned by Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, was to be played by the celebrated violinist Miss Clara Beaumont. The instrument, a masterpiece from 1715, was said to sing with a voice that could move the hardest heart. Miss Marple, though no musician herself, appreciated its significance. Having read about it in the festival program, as she paused to adjust a stitch, her young maid, Lily, burst into the room, her cheeks flushed. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, clutching her apron. "Mr. Hawthorne's violin, that Stradivarius, it's gone. Stolen, they say, right from the village hall. And Mr. Hawthorne himself found unconscious in his study, struck down by some villain." Miss Marple's needle stilled, her mild blue eyes sharpening. "Stolen, you say, and Mr. Hawthorne harmed." She set her knitting aside, her mind already sifting through the implications. A violin of such value doesn't vanish without purpose. "Lily, tell me everything you've heard." Lily, eager to share the village's latest scandal, recounted the details. The violin had been secured in a locked case in the village hall, where it was displayed under the watchful eye of Mr. Ernest Whitby, the curator of the local museum. Mr. Hawthorne, a widower and retired barrister who had settled in St. Mary Mead for its quiet charm, was known to guard the instrument jealously, allowing only Miss Beaumont to play it. Last evening, after a private meeting at his manor, he was found slumped over his desk, a bruise blooming on his temple. The violin's case, still locked, was empty. The village was abuzz with speculation, and Inspector Craddock was already at the manor, questioning the household. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "This is most intriguing," she murmured. "A thief bold enough to strike a man, and clever enough to leave a locked case behind. We shall see." She donned her hat, a sensible black felt affair, and set out for Hawthorne Manor, her curiosity piqued. The walk was short, the manor's Georgian facade looming at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of dignified seclusion. Upon arrival, she found Inspector Craddock in the study, his notebook open and his brow furrowed. The room was a scholar's haven, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Papers lay scattered across the floor. A crystal decanter had spilled its contents onto a Persian rug, and a single armchair lay tipped on its side. The violin's case, An elegant affair of polished wood and brass sat open on a side table, its velvet lining glaringly empty. A faint, acrid scent hung in the air, which Miss Marple recognized at once. "Chloroform, Inspector?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Craddock, a young man who respected Miss Marple's uncanny insight, nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple," the doctor confirmed it. "Poor Hawthorne was knocked out before he could raise an alarm. He's awake now, but groggy, can't recall much beyond a shadow moving behind him." He gestured to the window, its latch intact but the frame bearing a faint scratch. "The thief likely came through here, though how they managed the case's lock is a mystery." Miss Marple bent to examine the floor, her eyes catching a single muddy footprint near the window, its edges crisp against the polished wood. "A curious thief," she remarked, "to leave such a mark yet manage a lock known only to Mr. Hawthorne and Miss Beaumont." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the room, and the case itself undamaged, unforced. One might almost think the violin was spirited away. Craddock sighed, with 4 suspects so far. Maestro Vittorio Bellini, the festival's conductor, who was overseeing rehearsals. Miss Clara Beaumont, the violinist, who handled the instrument. Mr. Ernest Whitby, the curator who secured it for display. And Lord Percival Drake, a collector who's been sniffing around the violin all week. Each claims to have been elsewhere, but we're checking their stories. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "People's stories, Inspector, are like their gardens carefully tended, but the weeds always show." She stepped to the window, noting the view of the village hall across the green. "I think I shall take a stroll, perhaps speak to a few souls. The festival must go on. After all." As she left the manor, the village clock chimed 5, and the distant strains of a violin lesser than the Stradivarius no doubt drifted from the hall. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the threads of motive and opportunity. A violin stolen, a man attacked, and a locked case left empty. It was a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The late afternoon sun had dipped below the horizon, casting St. Mary Mead in a soft twilight as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Hawthorne Manor. The air carried the faint chill of early autumn, and the village, usually so serene, buzzed with the undercurrent of scandal. The theft of the Stradivarius violin and the assault on Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and sharp eyes, was determined to unravel the mystery before it grew cold. Her sensible shoes clicked softly on the cobblestone path as she approached the manor's imposing gates, her mind already sifting through the details. Lily had breathlessly relayed earlier that day. Hawthorne Manor stood at the edge of the village, its Georgian elegance softened by climbing ivy and the glow of gas lamps flickering to life. The house, with its tall windows and symmetrical facade, seemed to guard its secrets as jealously as its owner had guarded his prized violin. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting the well-tended rose bushes and the gravel path leading to the front door undisturbed, save for the faint tracks of police boots. She adjusted her shawl, her thoughts lingering on the curious nature of the crime. A violin stolen from a locked case, its owner struck down, and a single muddy footprint left as if to taunt the investigators. A deliberate clue, she murmured, or a careless mistake. Inside, the manor's entrance hall was a study in understated opulence. A crystal chandelier cast prismatic light across the marble floor, and a grand staircase curved upward to shadowed landings. Inspector Craddock, a young man with an earnest demeanour and a growing respect for Miss Marple's insights, met her at the door. His tie was slightly askew, a sign of the long hours he'd already spent on the case. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice tinged with relief. "I was hoping you'd come. This business is a tangle, and Mr. Hawthorne's not much help yet." "Poor man," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes alert. "Is he still unwell?" "Awake, but muddled," Craddock said, leading her toward the study. "The doctor says it's the chloroform and the blow to the head. He remembers a figure in the dark, nothing more. We've got the household staff's statements, but they're a nervous lot, and none saw anything unusual." The study, when they reached it, was a room of scholarly chaos, its order disrupted by the violence of the previous night. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on law, music, and history, their spines gleaming in the lamplight. A heavy oak desk dominated the center, its surface littered with papers, an overturned inkwell, and a silver cigarette case that had skittered to the edge. The Persian rug beneath was stained with a splash of brandy from a shattered decanter, its sharp scent mingling with the faint, lingering trace of chloroform. Miss Marple's nose wrinkled slightly as she took it in, her mind noting the chemical's presence as a calculated choice. "Chloroform," she said softly, "requires proximity and patience, not the work of an impulsive thief." Craddock nodded, gesturing to the side table where the violin's case sat, its polished wood gleaming under the light. The case was a work of art in itself, crafted to cradle the Stradivarius with velvet-lined precision, its brass lock intricate and unblemished. "That's the puzzle," he said. The lock wasn't forced. Only Mr. Hawthorne and Miss Clara Beaumont knew its combination, and Hawthorne swears he didn't open it. Yet the violin's gone, and the case was left behind empty. Miss Marple approached the case, her gloved fingers tracing its edges. The lock, a complex mechanism of dials and tumblers, showed no signs of tampering. She bent closer, her eyes catching the faintest scratch on the brass, so subtle it might have been overlooked. "Curious," she murmured, "that a thief should manage such a lock yet leave this mark." She straightened, her gaze drifting to the window across the room. It was a tall mullioned affair, its latch secure but the frame bearing a faint gouge, as if a tool had been used to pry it open. Near the base, on the polished oak floor, lay the muddy footprint Craddock had mentioned, a single, distinct impression, its edges crisp and its tread suggesting a fine, expensive shoe. "A gentleman's shoe, perhaps," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "Italian leather, by the look of it. Not common in St. Mary Mead." She knelt, careful not to disturb the mark, and noted the soil's reddish hue, similar to the earth in the manor's garden. "This footprint," she continued, "is rather theatrical, don't you think? Left so prominently, as if to announce the thief's exit." Craddock frowned, scribbling in his notebook. "Theatrical or not, it's our best clue. We're having it analyzed, but the mud matches the garden path. The windows are a likely entry point, though how they got past the lock is beyond me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Locks, Inspector, are only as secure as the people who know their secrets." She moved to the desk, where the scattered papers caught her attention. Among them were letters, concert programs, and a handwritten note in Hawthorne's precise script detailing the violin's provenance. One document, half buried under a book, was a receipt from a London insurer, valuing the Stradivarius at a staggering sum. "A motive in itself," she remarked, handing it to Craddock. Such wealth invites envy. Craddock scanned the receipt, his brow furrowing. We've narrowed it down to 4 suspects, based on their access and opportunity. First, Maestro. Vittorio Bellini, the festival conductor. He was in the village hall last night, overseeing rehearsals, but claims he was alone after 10. No one can confirm it. Then there's Miss Clara Beaumont, the violinist. She was with Hawthorne earlier that evening, discussing the performance. She left him unharmed, she says, but she knew the case's combination. Miss Marple nodded, her mind picturing the fiery maestro and the delicate violinist. And the others, Mr. Ernest Whitby, the museum curator, Craddock continued. He was in charge of the violin's display in the village hall. He checked the case at 6 o'clock and swears it was secure. He says he was home alone. Afterward, lastly, Lord Percival Drake, a collector from London. He's been a fixture at the festival, always hovering near the violin. He claims he was at a dinner party at Mrs. Bantry's, but we're verifying that. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. A conductor, a violinist, a curator, and a collector such a varied cast, and all with reasons to be near the violin. She glanced at the overturned chair, its carved legs askew. This room tells a story, Inspector. The brandy spilled. The papers scattered it suggests haste, but not panic. The thief knew what they wanted and where to find it. Craddock rubbed his chin. You think it was planned, then? Not a spur-of-the-moment job. Oh, quite planned, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but certain. The chloroform, the untouched lock, the single footprints are all too neat for impulse. Someone wanted the violin and was willing to harm Mr. Hawthorne to get it. But why leave the case? It's valuable in itself, and a thief in a hurry might have taken it. She moved to the window again, peering out at the darkened garden. The village hall's lights glimmered across the green, where musicians were still rehearsing, their notes faint but persistent. The village hall is so close, she mused. A short walk, yet no one saw anything unusual. Or so they claim. Craddock followed her gaze. We've questioned the groundskeeper, Mr. Potts. He was near the hall last night, tending the hedges. Says he saw a figure in a dark coat near the manor around 10, but couldn't make them out. Too far, too dark. A dark coat, Miss Marple repeated, filing the detail away. Common enough, yet worth noting. She turned back to the room, her eyes lingering on the desk. A small, silver cigarette case caught her attention, its lid engraved with Hawthorne's initials. It was slightly ajar, revealing a single cigarette, its paper pristine. Mr. Hawthorne doesn't smoke, does he? She asked. Craddock shook his head. Not that I know of. His housekeeper says he keeps the case as a memento from his late wife. Why? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, her fingers brushing the case's edge. Just a thought, she said lightly. Things left behind are as telling as things taken. She stepped back, her mind weaving connections. The cigarette case, the footprint, the chloroform all were pieces of a puzzle, and she suspected the solution lay not in the objects themselves, but in the people who moved among them. May I speak with Mr. Hawthorne? She asked, her tone polite but firm. Craddock hesitated. He's weak, and the doctors advised rest. But if you think it'll help, it may, Miss Marple said simply. They ascended the staircase to Hawthorne's bedroom, where the retired barrister lay propped against pillows, his face pale and his eyes shadowed. He was a man in his 60s, with a lean frame and a shock of white hair, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped water from a glass. Miss Marple, he said. his voice frail but courteous. "I'm told you have a knack for these things." She smiled, settling into a chair beside him. "I only observe, Mr. Hawthorne. Can you tell me what you remember?" He frowned, his brow creasing. "It's hazy. I was in my study, reviewing some papers. Clara Miss Beaumont had just left. We'd been discussing the concert then. A shadow behind me, a cloth over my face, and a sharp pain. I woke to find the violin gone." His voice broke, and he clutched the bed covers. "That Stradivarius was my pride, Miss Marple. A legacy." Miss Marple patted his hand gently. "We shall do our best to recover it. Did you hear anything?" "Voice, perhaps, or a sound." Hawthorne shook his head. "Nothing distinct, only a faint rustle like fabric, and the smell sharp chemical. Then darkness." She nodded, her mind cataloguing his words. "And the case's combination only. You and Miss Beaumont knew it." "Yes," he said firmly. "I changed it weekly. As a precaution. Clara needed it to practice with the violin. No one else." Miss Marple rose, thanking him. As she descended the stairs with Craddock, she said, "A shadow and a rustle. Not much, but enough to start with." She paused in the entrance hall, glancing at a portrait of Hawthorne's late wife, her serene face framed by a lace collar. "People, Inspector, are rarely as shadowy as they seem. We must look at their reasons for being here, and what they hoped to gain." Craddock sighed. "I've got men checking alibis and searching the grounds, but this footprint and the lock, they don't add up." "They will," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but certain. "In time, they always do." She stepped into the evening air, the village hall's lights now brighter against the darkening sky. The festival would continue, but the absence of the Stradivarius cast a pall over it. As she walked home, her thoughts turned to the suspects. Bellini's temper, Clara's ambition, Whitby's meticulousness, Drake's obsession. Each had a role in this drama, and Miss Marple intended to discover which one had stepped out of line. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome. The study's disarray, the footprints, prominence, the cigarette cases, oddity, they were all threads in a tapestry, and she would pull them until the pattern emerged. People, she said to herself, are so very predictable, even when they think they're clever. And with that, she turned her mind to the next step, a visit to the village hall, where the festival's heart still beat, and where, she suspected, more clues awaited. Chapter 3. The maestro's temper. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the St. Mary Mead village hall, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor where the festival orchestra was assembling for rehearsal. The air hummed with the discordant tuning of strings and the occasional trill of a woodwind, but an undercurrent of tension lay beneath the music. The theft of the Stradivarius had rippled through the village, and whispers of suspicion followed. The musicians like a persistent minor chord. Miss Jane Marple, her black felt hat slightly tilted and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, stepped into the hall, her presence as unassuming as a sparrow among peacocks. Yet her mild blue eyes missed nothing, and she had come to observe Maestro Vittorio Bellini, the festival's tempestuous conductor, whose fiery reputation preceded him. The hall was a modest structure, its whitewashed walls adorned with faded posters from past festivals and a single chandelier that gleamed despite its age. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where Bellini stood, his baton slashing the air as he berated a hapless cellist for a missed cue. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was dishevelled, and his expressive hands moved with a vigor that seemed to ignite the very air. "Imbecile," he barked, his Italian accent sharp. "Do you think Vivaldi wrote for donkeys?" Again, from the top. The orchestra, accustomed to his outbursts, reset their scores with resigned glances. Miss Marple settled into a chair at the back, her knitting needles emerging as she began a row of neat stitches. She found the maestro's performance as revealing as the music itself. Bellini was a man of passion, but passion, she knew, could mask other motives. His name had surfaced in Inspector Craddock's list of suspects, and his lack of an alibi for the night of the theft intrigued her. He had claimed to be alone in this very hall, refining the festival program long after the musicians had left. A solitary genius, she murmured, her needles clicking, or a convenient excuse. As the orchestra launched into a spirited rendition of Vivaldi's Spring, Miss Marple's gaze wandered. The hall was a stone's throw from Hawthorne Manor, its rear door visible through a side window, offering a clear view of the manor's garden path. A thief could have slipped across in minutes, she thought, especially under cover of darkness. Her eyes returned to Bellini, noting the ink stains on his fingers' black smudges that seemed out of place for a conductor who wielded a baton, not a pen. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the muddy footprint in Hawthorne's study. Could Bellini's polished Italian shoes, now tapping impatiently on the platform, match that distinctive tread? The rehearsal paused, and Bellini, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, caught sight of Miss Marple. His scowl softened into a practiced charm as he descended the platform and approached her. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, his voice a warm baritone now, though his dark eyes were wary. "I am told you are a sleuth of sorts. Come to hear my orchestra, or to accuse me of stealing violins?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming, her eyes crinkling with apparent innocence. "Oh, I'm no sleuth, maestro, merely a villager fond of music. Your Vivaldi is quite splendid, though I confess I'm curious about this dreadful theft. Such a loss to the festival." Bellini's jaw tightened, and he waved a hand dismissively. "A distraction, nothing more. That violin was Miss Beaumont's responsibility. She was to play it. Not one my concern is the music, not some overpriced relic." His tone was sharp, but Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in his expression, as if he regretted his words. "You were here last night. I understand," she said, her needles never pausing. "Working late, all alone. It must be tiring, such dedication." "Art demands sacrifice," Bellini replied, his chest puffing slightly. "I was revising the score until nearly midnight. No one saw me because no one needed to. My work speaks for itself, of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how close this hall is to Mr. Hawthorne's manor? A short walk across the green, really. One might almost see it from here." She glanced toward the window, her gaze inviting him to follow. Bellini's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his fingers twitching as if longing for his baton. "I know nothing of the theft," he said at last. "I was here, as I said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an orchestra to manage." He turned abruptly, striding back to the platform, where he resumed his tirade against a flautist's timing. Miss Marple watched him, her mind as busy as her needles. Bellini's temper was no secret village gossip, painted him as a man who clashed with musicians and organizers alike. Had he quarreled with Hawthorne, perhaps over the violin's use? Or was his late-night solitude a cover for a more sinister errand? The ink stains puzzled her. Most conductors rarely handled pens so carelessly. yet the stains suggested recent, hurried writing, a letter, perhaps, or a note left behind. She made a mental note to inquire about any papers found in the manor that might bear such marks. As the rehearsal continued, Miss Marple slipped out, pausing by the hall's rear door. The garden path to the manor was, indeed, short, bordered by low hedges that offered little cover. A groundskeeper, Mr. Potts, was raking leaves nearby, his weathered face creased with concentration. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm. "Good morning, Mr. Potts. A fine day for the festival, despite the troubles." Potts leaned on his rake, glad for a break. "Aye, Miss Marple, but a bad business with Mr. Hawthorne's violin. Never thought I'd see such doings in St. Mary Mead." "You were here last night, I believe," she said, her tone conversational. "Near the hall, tending the grounds. Did you notice anything unusual?" Potts scratched his chin, his eyes squinting as he recalled. "Well, now, I did see a figure by the manor, round 10 or so. Dark coat, moving quick like near the study window. Couldn't see who, mind too far, and the moon was dim. Thought it might be one of them musicians, but I didn't linger to find out." Miss Marple nodded, her mind picturing the shadowy figure. "A dark coat," she repeated, "and no one else about." "Not a soul," Potts said. The hall was quiet, save for the maestro's shouting. Heard him through the walls, cursing the violins for being flat. "Thank you, Mr. Potts," she said, patting his arm. "You've been most helpful." As she walked away, her thoughts turned to Bellini's solitary rehearsal. His temper, his proximity, his unverified alibi all pointed to opportunity, but motive remained elusive. Was the Stradivarius merely a prize, or did it represent something more personal to the maestro? Back in the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office, where Mrs. Murgatroyd, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. Murgatroyd," Miss Marple said, her knitting bag swinging gently. "Wonder if you've had any unusual correspondence lately, perhaps for Maestro Bellini." Mrs. Murgatroyd, always eager for a chat, leaned over the counter. "Funny you should ask, Miss Marple. He did get a letter from London 2 days back. Thick envelope, official looking, but he snatched it up quick and didn't say a word. Not that he's the chatty sort." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, and no other letters, say, with ink smudges or hasty writing?" "Not that I've seen," Mrs. Murgatroyd replied, shaking her head. "Though with all this festival business, I've been run off my feet." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the street, the village hall's music now a faint echo. Bellina's ink-stained fingers and the London letter suggested a man with secrets, but whether they involved the Stradivarius was another matter. She thought of the other suspects, Clara Beaumont's delicate hands, Ernest Whitby's nervous precision, Lord Drake's polished charmant, wondered how their paths crossed with the maestro's. The footprint, the chloroform, the untouched. These were not the work of a temperamental artist alone, but of someone with calculation and access. As she neared her cottage, Miss Marple paused to admire her garden, where the last roses of summer clung stubbornly to their stems. "People are like roses," she mused, "beautiful in their way, but their thorns always show." She resolved to visit Clara Beaumont next, to hear the violinist's story and gauge her tears. The maestro's temper was a vivid thread in this tapestry, but Miss Marple knew the pattern was far from complete. Chapter 4. The violinist's tears. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and lending an air of quiet melancholy to the village. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, made her way to Rose Cottage, where Miss Clara Beaumont, the festival's celebrated violinist, had taken up residence for the duration of the event. The theft of the Stradivarius and the assault on Mr. Hawthorne had cast a shadow over the festival, and Clara, who was to have played the precious instrument, was said to be distraught. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, suspected that tears could hide as much as they revealed, and she intended to see for herself. Rose Cottage was a charming affair, its whitewashed walls half hidden by climbing roses, their petals now drooping in the damp air. The small garden gate creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. She knocked lightly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal Clara Beaumont, her delicate features pale and her hazel eyes red-rimmed from crying. She wore a simple muslin dress, its hem slightly frayed, and clutched a silk handkerchief embroidered with a delicate C. The sight of Miss Marple seemed to startle her, but she managed a tremulous smile. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice soft and musical, though strained. "I wasn't expecting visitors. Please, come in." The cottage's parlour was cosy, with chintz curtains and a small fire crackling in the grate. A violin case, not the Stradivarius's, but Clara's own, rested on a side table, its worn leather suggesting years of devoted use. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair, her knitting needles emerging as she began a row of pearl stitches. "I do hope I'm not intruding," she said, her tone gentle. "I heard you were unwell after this dreadful business with Mr. Hawthorne's violin, and I thought a chat might lift your spirits." Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she sank onto a settee, twisting the handkerchief in her hands. "It's too awful," she whispered. "That Stradivarius, it was my soul's voice, Miss Marple. To play it was to touch something divine, and now it's gone, and poor Mr. Hawthorne." Her voice broke, and she dabbed at her eyes. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her gaze warm but watchful. "A terrible loss, indeed," she said. "You were with Mr. Hawthorne that evening, I understand, discussing the concert." Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Yes, I went to the manor around 7. We spoke about the program batch, Vivaldi, a touch of Paganini. He was so proud of the violin, you know, but also protective. He only let me play it because he trusted my skill." She paused, her lips trembling. "I left him just after 8, perfectly well. I swear I saw no one else, and the violin was still in its case when I left." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes lingering on Clara's delicate frame. The violinist was slight, her hands fine-boned and nimble, suited to coaxing music from strings but hardly capable of overpowering a man like Hawthorne. Yet, Miss Marple knew, appearances could deceive. "You knew the case's combination, didn't you?" she asked, her voice mild. "Mr. Hawthorne said only you and he had that knowledge." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her fingers plucking at the handkerchief's edge. "Yes, he shared it with me for the rehearsals. It was a complicated lock dials and tumblers changed weekly. I needed it to access the violin for practice, but I didn't touch the case that night, I promise. I left it locked, as always." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. She noted the handkerchief's fine silk, its embroidery exquisite but slightly worn, suggesting it was a cherished possession rather than a recent purchase. "It's curious, though, that the thief managed the lock without force. One wonders how they knew its secret." Clara's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. I told no one, Miss Marple. I'd never betray Mr. Hawthorne's trust. That violin meant everything to me. Her voice rose, a note of desperation creeping in. I'm to play at the festival's finale tomorrow, and now I must use my own. Violin a good instrument, but nothing like the Stradivarius. It's like losing a piece of myself. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind turning over Clara's words. The violinist's grief seemed genuine, but grief, she knew, could be a mask for guilt or fear. Clara's knowledge of the lock made her a natural suspect, yet her slight build and evident devotion to the instrument argued against her involvement in a violent theft. Still, Miss Marple recalled village gossip about Clara's ambition. Young woman determined to rise in the musical world, perhaps at any cost. Could ambition have driven her to desperate measures, or was she merely a victim of circumstance? You left the manor at 8, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. Did you return to the village hall for rehearsal, or come straight here? Here, Clara said quickly. I was tired and needed to rest. I saw no one after leaving Mr. Hawthorne, and I was alone until morning. She hesitated, then added, I heard about the theft from Mrs. Bantry's maid, who came by at dawn. I couldn't believe it. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the violin. Case on the table? May I? She asked, gesturing toward it. Clara nodded, and Miss Marple rose, opening the case to reveal a well-worn violin, its wood polished by years of use. A few sheets of music lay inside, annotated in Clara's neat hand. You practiced diligently, Miss Marple remarked, noting the meticulous markings. Such dedication must make the loss of the Stradivarius all the more painful. Clara's tears spilled over again, and she buried her face in her handkerchief. It's unbearable, she murmured. I don't know how I'll perform without it. Miss Marple closed the case gently and returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythmic click. You'll manage, my dear, she said kindly. Talent like yours finds a way. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the threads of Clara's story. The violinist's alibi was as solitary as Bellini's, and her emotional display, while convincing, could be rehearsed. The combination lock loomed large in Miss Marple's thoughts. Only Clara and Hawthorne knew its secret. Yet the thief had bypassed it with ease. Was Clara hiding something, or had someone else gleaned the combination through cunning or betrayal? As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small photograph on the mantelpiece. Younger Clara, smiling beside an older man who resembled her, perhaps a father or mentor. Your family? She asked, her tone conversational. Clara glanced at the photo, her expression softening. My uncle, he taught me to play. He passed away last year. I'm sorry, Miss Marple said, her eyes lingering on the frame. The uncle's face was stern, his posture rigid, suggesting a man of discipline. She wondered if Clara's ambition stemmed from his influence, and whether it might have pushed her to extremes. Family, she added, has a way of shaping us, doesn't it? Clara nodded, her eyes distant. He always said music was worth any sacrifice. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the garden, the mist now lifting to reveal a pale blue sky. As she walked back to the village, her thoughts turned to the other suspects. Bellini's temper and ink-stained fingers suggested a man with secrets, but Clara's tears and solitary evening raised their own questions. The lock's mystery gnawed at her head. Clara shared the combination, perhaps unwittingly, or was there another way to open it? And the footprint, so prominently left, seemed almost too convenient, as if meant to distract. She paused by the village green, where children played near the hall, their laughter a stark contrast to the festival's somber mood. Clara's devotion to the Stradivarius was clear, but devotion, Miss Marple knew, could twist into obsession. She resolved to speak with Mr. Whitby, the curator, next, to learn more about the violin's display and who might have lingered near it. As her needles resumed their work in her mind's eye, she thought of St. Mary Mead's quiet facades, behind which secrets always lurked. People, she murmured, are never quite what they seem. Chapter 5. The curator's cautioned the sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the morning mist and bathing the village in a gentle warmth. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side, walked briskly toward the small museum that stood at the heart of the village, its stone facade as unassuming as the secrets it might hold. The theft of Mr. Hawthorne's Stradivarius violin and the assault on its owner had stirred the village into a quiet frenzy, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the ordinary to the extraordinary, was determined to examine every thread of this tangled affair. Her next stop was Mr. Ernest Whitby, the museum curator, whose meticulous oversight of the violin's display made him a figure of interest in Inspector Craddock's investigation. The museum, a converted Georgian house, was a treasure trove of local history, its rooms filled with artifacts ranging from Roman coins to Victorian lace. As Miss Marple stepped through the creaking door, a bell jingled, and the scent of polished wood and old paper greeted her. The main hall, where the Stradivarius had been displayed, was cordoned off with a velvet rope, a silent testament to the crime. Mr. Whitby stood behind a glass case, adjusting his spectacles as he catalogued a collection of pewter tankards. He was a thin, wiry man in his 50s, with a nervous habit of blinking rapidly when addressed. His grey suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, though Miss Marple noted a faint scuff on one toe, as if from a recent misstep. "Good morning, Mr. Whitby," she said, her voice warm and disarming. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Such a charming museum you keep." Whitby started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Miss Marple, no, not at all. I'm just keeping busy." He adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly. "This business with the violin, it's dreadful. I've never known such a thing in St. Mary Mead." "Quite shocking," Miss Marple agreed, setting her knitting bag on a nearby chair and producing her needles. She began a row of neat stitches, her eyes never leaving Whitby's face. "You were responsible for the violin's display, I understand. It must have been a great honor." Whitby nodded, his expression a mix of pride and unease. "Oh yes, Mr. Hawthorne entrusted me with its care during the festival. I ensured the case was locked each evening, checked it myself at 6 o'clock. On the night of the theft, it was secure, Miss Marple, I swear it." He gestured toward the display area where an empty pedestal stood, its velvet cushion bare. "The Stradivarius was the centerpiece of our exhibitor masterpiece." Miss Marple moved toward the pedestal, her needles pausing as she examined the spotless glass case that had housed the violin. "A locked case, you say," she mused, "and yet the thief left it behind, untouched. Most peculiar." She glanced at Whitby, noting his rapid blinking. "You keep a logbook, I believe, of visitors to the exhibit." Yes, Whitby said, hurrying to a small desk and retrieving a leather-bound ledger. "Every visitor signs in as a precaution. We had many come to see the violin musicians, locals, even Lord Drake, the collector. He was here often, admiring it." He opened the book, revealing pages of names and times, written in his precise, angular script. Miss Marple peered at the entries, her eyes catching Lord Drake's name several times, his visits lingering longer than most. Lord Drake seems quite taken with the Stradivarius, she remarked, her tone light. Did he ever ask about the case or its lock? Whitby hesitated, his fingers tapping the ledger. He did inquire about its security, yes. Said he was interested in how such treasures are protected. I told him the case was custom-made, with a combination lock known only to Mr. Hawthorne. And Miss Beaumont? He seemed satisfied. His voice faltered, and he adjusted his spectacles again. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. And where were you after checking the case at 6? Inspector Craddock said you were home alone. Whitby's cheeks flushed, and he nodded vigorously. Yes, I returned to my cottage. I had paperwork to finish museum records, you know. I was there all evening, alone. He glanced at the floor, his scuffed shoe shifting slightly. Heard about the theft the next morning from the groundskeeper, Mr. Potts. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. She noted the scuff on his shoe, so unlike the pristine footprint in Hawthorne's study, and the absence of mud on his soles. Whitby's caution, his meticulous nature, seemed at odds with the boldness of the theft, yet his nervousness suggested something unspoken. You must have been near the manor at some point, she added casually. It's so close to the hall. Whitby's eyes widened, and he shook his head. No, I didn't go near the manor that night. I saw Lord Drake there, though around 7, walking toward the village green. He was in a dark coat, carrying a cane. I thought nothing of it. He's a regular at the festival. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. A dark coat, she repeated, recalling Mr. Potts's account of a similar figure. How observant of you, Mr. Whitby. She closed the logbook gently, her mind turning over his words. Whitby's alibi, like Clara's and Bellini's, was solitary, and his mention of Drake placed the collector near the crime scene, but his nervous demeanor, those twitching fingers, that rapid blinking hinted at a man under pressure, perhaps from more than just the theft. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small display of antique pens, their nibs gleaming under the museum's lights. You're fond of pens, I see, she said, nodding toward the case. Do you use them yourself? Whitby blinked, caught off guard. Oh, occasionally. For official documents, you know. I prefer a fountain pen keeps. The record's neat. He gestured to a pen on his desk, its barrel stained with faint traces of ink. Very precise. Miss Marple said, her voice warm, but her mind noting the similarity to Bellini's ink-stained fingers. Could Whitby's pen have left a mark somewhere? In the manor, perhaps among the scattered papers. She thanked him and stepped into the street, the museum's bell jingling behind her. The village was coming to life, with festival-goers milling about and the distant strains of a violin drifting from the hall. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts weaving together the threads of the case. Whitby's caution, his meticulous logbook, and his solitary evening painted a picture of a man who valued order, yet his nervousness suggested a hidden worry. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the strain of responsibility? And Drake's frequent visits to the exhibit, his questions about the lockthose were threads worth. Pulling Dot as she walked toward her cottage, Miss Marple passed the village green, where a group of children played near the hall. She thought of Clara's tears, Bellini's temper, and now Whitby's unease, each a piece of the puzzle. The footprint, the chloroform, the untouched lockthese were deliberate choices, not accidents. People, she murmured, adjusting. Her hat always leave traces, even when they try to hide. Her next step was clear, a visit to Lord Drake, to see what lay behind his polished charm and collector's eye. Chapter 6. The Collector's Charm. The midday sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, its light glinting off the Dukist lawns as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Drake Hall. The grand estate of Lord Percival Drake, the final suspect in the theft of Mr. Hawthorne's Stradivarius violin. The village hummed with the subdued excitement of the music festival, but the shadow of the crime lingered, and Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, was determined to unravel the motives behind it. Lord Drake, a wealthy collector, with a passion for rare instruments, had been a frequent visitor to the violin's display, and his presence near Hawthorne Manor on the night of the theft intrigued her. With her unassuming air and keen observation, she intended to probe the collector's polished exterior for any cracks. Drake Hall stood at the village's edge, a sprawling manor of red brick and tall chimneys, its windows reflecting the sunlight. Like watchful eyes, the gravel drive was lined with neatly trimmed yews, and a fountain bubbled softly in the courtyard, lending an air of serene opulence. Miss Marple rang the bell, and a butler, his demeanour as crisp as his starched collar, ushered her into a drawing-room that exuded wealth. The walls were adorned with paintings of pastoral scenes, and glass cabinets displayed an array of artifacts, porcelain vases, jade figurines, and, most notably, a collection of violins, their polished wood gleaming under the chandelier light. Lord Drake entered with a smile that was both warm and calculated, his tall frame clad in a tailored suit of charcoal grey. His hair, silver at the temples, was impeccably groomed, and his blue eyes held a spark of amusement, as if he found the world perpetually entertaining. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "what a delight! I've heard of your reputation for solving little mysteries. To what do I owe the pleasure?" He gestured to a plush armchair, and a maid appeared with a silver tray bearing a teapot and delicate china cups. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting needles emerging as she began a row of careful stitches. "You're too kind, Lord Drake," she said, her tone mild. "I'm merely a villager curious about this dreadful business with Mr. Hawthorne's violin. It's such a loss to the festival, and I understand you were quite taken with the instrument." Drake's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "Briefly, a tragedy indeed," he said, pouring tea with practiced ease. "The Stradivarius was a masterpiece. I admired it greatly during its display at the museum, but theft, I'd never stoop to such a thing." He handed her a cup, his movements graceful. "I'm a collector, Miss Marple, not a criminal." "Of course," she replied, sipping the tea and noting its fine quality. Her eyes wandered to the violins in the cabinet, their strings taut and their craftsmanship exquisite, though none bore the distinctive markings of a Stradivarius. "Your collection is remarkable," she said. "You must have a keen eye for such treasures." Drake leaned back, his expression one of modest pride. "I've spent years acquiring them. Each has a story, a voice, but none, I confess, compared to Hawthorne's violin." Its tone was otherworldly. His voice softened, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something longing perhaps in his gaze. She set her cup down, her needles clicking steadily. "You were at the museum often, I hear, asking Mr. Whitby about the violin's security. A natural interest for a collector, I suppose." Drake chuckled, though it sounded a touch forced. "Curiosity, nothing more. I like to know how such treasures are protected." Whitby was quite thorough, said the case's lock was known only to Hawthorne and Miss Beaumont. A clever system, though clearly not foolproof. He shrugged, his fingers brushing the arm of his chair. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a locked cabinet in the corner. Its dark wood, unadorned, but its keyhole prominent. "And where were you that evening?" she asked, her tone conversational. "Mrs. Bantry's dinner party, I believe." "Yes," Drake said, his smile returning. "A charming affair. I was there until nearly 10, then took a stroll to clear my head. The festival can be overwhelming, you know." He paused, as if choosing his words. "I heard about the theft the next morning, like everyone else. Poor Hawthorne, I do hope he recovers." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the timing. 10 o'clock placed Drake near the manor when the theft occurred, and Mr. Whitby's sighting of a man in a dark coat matched the groundskeeper's account. She glanced at Drake's polished shoes, visible beneath the table, their soles free of mud. "You walked near the manor, perhaps," she said lightly. "It's such a short distance from Mrs. Bantry's." Drake's smile tightened, but he shook his head. "I kept to the village green, enjoying the evening air. I saw no one near the manor, though I suppose anyone could have slipped through the shadows." He leaned forward, his charm reasserting itself. "You don't suspect me, surely? I'm a guest here, not a thief." "Oh, I suspect no one in particular," Miss Marple said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "I only observe, Lord Drake. People are so fascinating, don't you think? Their passions, their secrets." Her gaze drifted to the locked cabinet again, and she added, "That cabinet must hold something special. Another violin, perhaps." Drake's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Just odds and ends," he said, waving a hand. "Old papers, nothing of interest. My best pieces are here for all to see." He gestured to the display, his tone dismissive. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose, thanking him for his hospitality. As the butler showed her out, she glanced back at the cabinet, its lock glinting in the light. Drake's charm was a polished veneer, but beneath it she sensed calculation. His interest in the violin's security, his proximity to the manor, and that locked cabinet suggested a man with more than a passing fancy for the Stradivarius. Yet his alibi, supported by Mrs. Bantry, held for now unless, of course, it could be shaken as she walked back through the village. The festival's music drifted from the hall, a reminder of the violin's absence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects: Bellini's ink-stained temper, Clara's tearful ambition, Whitby's nervous precision. Drake's charm was a new thread, but the locked cabinet and his evening stroll wove it tightly into the tapestry. She recalled the footprint in Hawthorne's study, its Italian leather distinct, and wondered if Drake's wardrobe held such a pair, perhaps tucked away to avoid scrutiny. At her cottage, Miss Marple paused to deadhead a rose, her mind busy. "Collectors," she murmured, "are driven by desire, and desire can lead to desperate acts." She resolved to speak with Mrs. Bantry to test the strength of Drake's alibi. The locked cabinet, the dark coat, the unforced lock, these were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was certain the collector's charm hid more than it revealed. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Gossington Hall, the home of her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The theft of the Stradivarius violin and the attack on Mr. Hawthorne had set the village abuzz with speculation, and Miss Marple knew that gossip, like a well-tended garden, often revealed truths hidden beneath its surface. Mrs. Bantry, with her ear for local chatter and her knack for hosting lively gatherings was the perfect source for the villagers' whispers. Miss Marple, her knitting bag swinging gently, intended to sift through these rumours to uncover any threads that might lead to the thief. Gossington Hall was a rambling country house, its red brick walls softened by wisteria and its windows gleaming with the day's fading light. Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a penchant for bright scarves and forthright opinions, welcomed Miss Marple into the drawing-room with a delighted exclamation. "Jane, you sly thing," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Come to pick my brain about this violin nonsense, I'll wager. Sit down, have some tea, and tell me what you're sniffing out." She waved to a tray laden with scones and a steaming teapot, her hospitality as warm as the fire crackling in the great dot. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting needles emerging as she began a row of delicate stitches. "You know me too well, Dolly," she said, her smile crinkling her eyes. "The village is full of talk about Mr. Hawthorne's violin, and I thought you might have heard something useful. People do love to chat at your dinners." Mrs. Bant chuckled, pouring tea with a flourish. "Oh, they chatter like magpies, especially after a glass of sherry. This theft has them all in a tizzy. Let's see," she leaned back, tapping her chin. "Maestro Bellini's temper is the talk of the tea-room. They say he stormed out of a rehearsal last week, shouting at Clara Beaumont for upstaging him. Called her a prima donna and worse, if you can believe it." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind filing away the detail. "Bellini does have a fiery streak," she said. "And Clara, what do they say of her?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with mischief. "Ambitious, that one. Word is she quarrelled with Hawthorne over the Stradivarius, wanted to play it in London, but he refused. Said it was too precious to leave St. Mary Mead. Some think she's got her eye on bigger stages, and losing the violin might ruin her chances. Mind you, she's all tears now, but folk wonder if they're crocodile tears." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Clara's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. "Ambition can be a powerful spur," she murmured. "And Mr. Whitby, the curator? Any whispers about him? Oh, Ernest Whitby," Mrs. Bantry said, spreading jam on a scone. "He's in a pickle, poor man. The grocer's wife says he's been borrowing money left and right. Something about bad investments. Keeps it quiet, of course, but you know how servants talk. They say he's been jumpy since the festival began, always fussing over that violin. Case like it was his own child." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained gentle. Whitby's debts were a new thread, one that suggested a motive for theft. A man in financial straits might see the Stradivarius as a way out, though his nervous demeanour hardly fit the boldness of the crime. "And Lord Drake?" she asked, her tone light. "He was at your dinner party that night, I believe." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her scarf fluttering. "Percival Drake, charming as ever. He was here, all right, dazzling everyone with stories of his travels. But he left early, said he had a headache and needed air. Must have been around 9:30, maybe. 10. I didn't think much of it. He's a bit of a loner, for all his polish. Folks say he's obsessed with rare instruments. The butcher's boy swears he saw Drake lingering near the museum after hours, staring at the violin like a man in love." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Drake's shaky alibi. 9:30 or 10, she repeated. Close. To the time of the theft. And he walked toward the village green, did he? "So he said," Mrs. Bantry replied, her brow furrowing. "But you know how dark it gets out there. He could have gone anywhere. Hawthorne's manor is just across the way. Mind you, he's got charm enough to talk his way out of anything. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Do you think he's mixed up in it, Jane? He's got the money to buy a dozen violins, but collectors can be queer about their prizes. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes distant. Collectors do have their passions, Dolly, and passions can lead to curious choices. She sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving together the villagers' whispers. Bellini's temper, Clara's ambition, Whitby's debts, Drake's obsession, each suspect had a shadow cast by their desires. And the timing of Drake's departure from the dinner party placed him dangerously close to the crime. As Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the festival's catering woes, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the village green lay quiet under the lengthening shadows. She recalled Mr. Potts, the groundskeeper, mentioning a figure in a dark coat near the manor around 10, a figure that could match Drake's description, or perhaps another's. The villagers' whispers were like the wind, carrying seeds of truth that needed only the right soil to take root. Dolly, Miss Marple said, interrupting her friend's tale of a misplaced cake order, did anyone else leave your party early that night? Or mention seeing someone near the manor? Mrs. Bantry paused, her scone halfway to her mouth. Not that I recall. Everyone was in high spirits except Drake, of course, with his headache. Oh, but Clara's maid did say something odd. She was fetching water from the pump near the green and saw a light flicker in the manor's study window just before 10. Thought it was Hawthorne working late, but now, well, it's queer, isn't it? Very queer, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. A light in the study, moments before the theft, suggested the thief had been inside, perhaps preparing their move. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and rose, her mind buzzing with new connections. The villagers' whispers had given her much to ponder. Bellini's clash with Clara, Whitby's financial strain, Drake's untimely exit, and now a flickering light that hinted at premeditation as she stepped into the cooling afternoon. Miss Marple glanced toward the village hall, where the festival's music drifted faintly. The Stradivarius was more than a violin, it was a magnet for envy, ambition, and greed. She thought of the muddy footprint, the chloroform's sharp scent, the unforced lock, each a deliberate stroke in a carefully painted picture. Whispers, she murmured, adjusting her hat, are like echoes. They lead you to the source if you listen carefully. Her next step would be to revisit the manor, to see what else the scene of the crime might whisper. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Mud. The early evening air carried a crisp edge as Miss Jane Marple walked the short distance from her cottage to Hawthorne Manor, her knitting bag tucked under her arm and her mind alight with the threads of the Stradivarius. Theft. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene, thrummed with the undercurrent of suspicion, and Miss Marple, with her quiet perceptiveness, was piecing together the puzzle of the stolen violin and the assault on its owner. The village whispers, gathered from Mrs. Bantry, had painted a vivid picture of the suspect's Mr. Bellini's temper, Clara Beaumont's ambition, Ernest Whitby's debts, and Lord Drake's obsession. But it was the physical evidence at the manor that now called her back. The muddy footprint, the unforced lock, and the lingering scent of chloroform were clues that demanded closer scrutiny, and Miss Marple intended to let the scene speak for itself. Hawthorne Manor loomed in the twilight, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the last of the day's light. The front door was ajar, guarded by a young constable who recognized Miss Marple and nodded her through with a respectful "Evening, ma'am." Inside, The entrance hall was quiet, the chandelier unlit, casting the marble floor in shadow. Inspector Craddock was in the study, his notebook open on the oak desk, his face etched with the frustration of a case that refused to yield its secrets. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression brightening. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was just going over the evidence again. This footprint's got me stumped." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a gentle smile as she set her knitting bag on a chair and drew out her needles, beginning a row of precise stitches. "Clues can be stubborn, Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "but they always tell a story if you know where to look. What have you learned about the footprint?" Craddock gestured to the spot near the window where the single muddy mark stood out against the polished oak floor. It was cordoned off with string, preserved for analysis. The labs confirmed it's from an Italian leather shoe, a rare brand sold only at a few shops in London. Expensive, too. The mud matches the soil in the manor's garden, but here's the odd bit. It's the only mark. No trail in or out, just this one print, clear as day. Miss Marple approached the footprint, her needles pausing as she bent to examine it. The tread was distinct, with a fine pattern that suggested craftsmanship, and the reddish mud was indeed identical to the garden's earth, which she'd noted on her earlier visit. "A single print," she murmured, "so carefully placed, almost as if it were meant to be found." She straightened, her gaze drifting to the window, where the faint scratch on the frame hinted at a forced entry, and the window still no signs of tampering beyond that mark. Craddock shook his head. "The latch is intact, but that scratch suggests a tool, maybe a knife. Yet the lock on the violin case, nothing. Not a scratch, not a dent. It's as if the thief knew the combination." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her eyes scanning the room. The study was much as she'd last seen it, papers scattered, the brandy decanter shattered. The overturned chair, but her attention lingered on the silver cigarette case, still ajar on the desk, its single cigarette untouched. "This footprint," she said, almost to herself, "is like a signature, too perfect to be accidental. I wonder if our thief wanted us to look for an outsider when the truth lies closer to home." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think it's staged, but the chloroform, the blow to Hawthorne's head, that's no act." "Oh, quite real," Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild. "But real acts can serve a false narrative. Suppose the thief entered another way through the door, perhaps, as a guest and left this print to mislead us. The window's scratch could be a flourish, not a necessity." She moved to the desk, her fingers brushing the cigarette case. "And this Mr. Hawthorne doesn't smoke, yet it's open. A curious detail, don't you think?" Craddock scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowing. "I hadn't thought much of the case. His housekeeper said it's a keepsake, rarely touched. You think it's significant?" "Everything is significant," Miss Marple said, her smile faint, "until it isn't." She turned to the violin's case, still open on its side table, its velvet lining empty. The lock's dials gleamed, unmarred by force. "The combination," she mused, "known only to Mr. Hawthorne and Miss Beaumont. Yet someone opened it without a trace. That suggests knowledge or cunning." Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're checking the suspect's shoes. Bellini's got a pair of Italian leather, but they're clean as a whistle. Clara's are too small, and Whitby's are scuffed but mud-free. Drake's we haven't seen them yet. He says he doesn't own anything like that, but I've sent a man to his manor to check." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the suspects. Bellini's ink-stained fingers and solitary rehearsal, Clara's tears and access to the lock, Whitby's debts and nervous precision, Drake's charm and untimely strolls had opportunity, but the footprint tied them to the manor's garden. "Have you searched the grounds again?" she asked. "The mud suggests the thief stepped outside, perhaps to dispose of something." "We did," Craddock said. "Found nothing but that vial in the garden chloroform," the chemist confirmed. "Tossed in the rose bushes, no prints." The thief was careful, except for that one footprint. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Careful, yet careless," she said. "A contradiction that bears watching." She moved to the window, peering out at the garden, where the rose bushes stood in orderly rows. The path to the village hall was visible, its gravel undisturbed. "The vial," she said. "Was it near the path to the hall?" Craddock checked his notes. "Yes, just off the main path, hidden in the bushes." "Why, only a thought," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "The hall is so close, someone could have slipped across, dropped the vial, and returned without notice. Especially if they knew the manor's layout." She paused, her mind returning to Mrs. Bantry's account of a light flickering in the study before 10. "And the light seen in this window, has anyone else mentioned it?" Craddock shook his head. "Just the maid's story. We're asking around, but so far, nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts weaving together the clues. The footprint, the vial, the flickering light, these were not random, but part of a deliberate act. The thief had entered, subdued Hawthorne, opened the case, and left a trail that pointed outward. Yet the absence of mud elsewhere suggested familiarity with the manor. She thanked Craddock and stepped into the evening air, the village hall's lights glowing across the green dot as she walked home. Miss Marple's mind turned to the suspects' alibis, each as solitary as the next. The footprint was a clue, but its singularity was its own mystery. "A thief who leaves one mark," she murmured, "wants it to be seen." She resolved to check with the village cobbler to see if any suspect had recently repaired or purchased Italian shoes. The mud was a clue, but the truth, she suspected, lay in the motives it concealed. Chapter 9. The hidden motive. The soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage as she prepared for an unusual gathering. The theft of Mr. Hawthorne's Stradivarius violin and the assault on its owner had woven a web of suspicion across St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, decided to bring the suspects together to observe their interactions. The village was settling into the quiet of late afternoon. The festival's music a distant hum, but the air held the tension of unresolved secrets. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, had invited Maestro Vittorio Bellini, Miss Clara Beaumont, Mr. Ernest Whitby, and Lord Percival Drake to tea, ostensibly to discuss the festival's continuation, but with the true purpose of watching foretells, those fleeting gestures that betray the heart's true intent. Her parlour was a cosy haven, its chintz curtains drawn against the evening chill and a fire crackling in the grate. The tea table was set with her best china, a silver teapot steaming gently, and plates of scones and cucumber sandwiches arranged with care. Miss Marple, in her neat black dress and lace cap, greeted each guest with her usual warmth, her knitting needles already clicking as she settled into her armchair. "Such a pleasure to see you all," she said, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. "This dreadful business with the violin mustn't dampen our spirits entirely." Maestro Bellini arrived first, his dark eyes flashing with impatience as he swept into the room, his silk scarf trailing dramatically. "This is a waste of time," he muttered, though he accepted a cup of tea with a grudging nod. The festival is in chaos, and I must rehearse, not sip tea. His ink-stained fingers tapped the arm of his chair, and Miss Marple noted his restless energy, as if he resented being scrutinized. Clara Beaumont followed. Her delicate frame swathed in a shawl, her hazel eyes still shadowed with grief. She clutched her silk handkerchief, its embroidered sea catching the firelight, and murmured a soft thank you as she took a seat. "I'm trying to stay strong," she said, her voice trembling, but without the Stradivarius, the concert feels hollow. Her gaze darted to Bellini, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of tension between them, a silent echo of their rumoured quarrel. Mr. Whitby entered next, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he adjusted them nervously. His grey suit was as impeccable as ever, but his hands fidgeted, betraying his unease. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice high, "it's kind of you to invite us, but I'm not sure what I can offer." This theft's left me quite shaken. He glanced at the others, his eyes lingering on Drake, and Miss Marple noted the subtle accusation in his posture. Lord Drake arrived last, his tailored suit and polished charm undimmed by the village's suspicions. He bowed slightly to Miss Marple, his smile as smooth as ever. "A charming gathering," he said, accepting a cup with a flourish. "Though I suspect, Miss Marple, you've more on your mind than tea." His blue eyes twinkled, but there was a wariness beneath his levity, as if he sensed the trap in her hospitality. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate as she steered the conversation to the festival. "Such a pity about the violin," she said, her tone conversational. "It was the heart of the event, wasn't it? I wonder what drives someone to steal such a treasure. Passion, perhaps, or greed." Her eyes moved from face to face, noting Bellini's scowl, Clara's wince, Whitby's twitch, and Drake's studied calm. Bellini snorted, setting his cup down with a clink. "Passion, bah, it's incompetence. That violin was Clara's too guard. She should have been more careful." His voice was sharp, and Clara's cheeks flushed, her fingers tightening on her handkerchief. "I did everything I could," Clara said, her voice rising. "The case was locked when I left Mr. Hawthorne. You were in the hall, Maestro, not me. Perhaps you saw something you haven't shared." Her accusation hung in the air, and Bellini's eyes narrowed, his fingers clenching. Whitby cleared his throat, his spectacles glinting as he leaned forward. "I checked the case at 6. As I told the inspector, it was secure. If anyone tampered with it, it wasn't on my watch." His gaze flicked to Drake, and he added, "Some were far too curious about that lock." Drake raised an eyebrow, his smile unfazed. "Curious, naturally. A Stradivarius is a collector's dream. But I was at Mrs. Bantry's dinner, as you well know, Mr. Whitby. My interest was purely academic." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, as if Whitby's barb had struck a nerve. She turned the conversation. "2 collections," her voice gentle. "You must have quite a collection, Lord Drake. Violins, perhaps. They say a true collector can't resist completing a set." Her needles clicked, and she watched his reaction closely. Drake's eyes lit up, a spark of genuine enthusiasm breaking through his polish. "I do have a few," he admitted, "but nothing to rival Hawthorne's. My pieces are modest by comparison, though each has its charm." He leaned forward, his voice warm. "A violin's voice is unique, Miss Marple. To own one is to hold a piece of history." Clara's lips trembled, and she murmured, "The Stradivarius was more than history. It was alive." Bellini rolled his eyes, and Whitby adjusted his spectacles, his fingers twitching as if eager to escape the room. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing their responses. Later, as the guests departed, she telephoned a contact in London, a discreet acquaintance in the antiques trade. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "might you check if Lord Drake has inquired about insuring a Stradivarius recently?" Discreetly, of course. Fletcher promised to investigate, and Miss Marple hung up, her thoughts turning to Whitby's debts, confirmed by the village banker. A man in financial straits might be tempted by a violin's value, but his timid nature seemed ill-suited to violence. As she resumed her knitting by the fire, Miss Marple pondered the gathering. Bellini's defensiveness, Clara's fragility, Whitby's nerves, and Drake's enthusiasm were threads in a tapestry of motive. The locked cabinet in Drake's study, the flickering light in the manor, the solitary footprint, these were clues to a hidden truth. "A collector completes his set in secret," she murmured, her needles clicking. "But secrets have a way of slipping out." Chapter 10. The Chloroform Clutha. Soft patter of rain began to fall over St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically while her mind sifted through the intricate puzzle of the stolen Stradivarius. Violin, the village, though alive with the music, festivals, preparations, remained shadowed by the theft and the assault on Mr. Reginald Hawthorne. The clues to muddy footprint, the unforced lock, the flickering light in the study pointed to a calculated crime, and Miss Marple's tea gathering had revealed tensions among the suspects. Maestro Bellini's bristling temper, Clara Beaumont's fragile tears, Ernest Whitby's nervous fidgeting, and Lord Drake's polished charm. Now a new piece of evidence had emerged, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing the human truth behind physical clues, was determined to explore it. Inspector Craddock had telephoned earlier that morning, his voice tinged with cautious excitement. The chemist's report had confirmed chloroform in Mr. Hawthorne's system, and a discarded vial had been found in the manor's rose bushes, its glass smudged but bearing no fingerprints. The discovery intrigued Miss Marple, for chloroform suggested not only premeditation but also a degree of intimicide. Ministering it required close contact, a steady hand, and a moment's trust from the victim. She decided to visit the village apothecary, Mr. Jenkins, whose shop was the only place in St. Mary Mead likely to stock such a substance. With her umbrella raised against the drizzle, she set out, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The apothecary shop, tucked between the bakery and the post office, was a narrow establishment with a bell that jingled cheerfully as Miss Marple entered. The air smelled of lavender and antiseptic, and shelves lined with bottles and jars gleamed in the dim light. Mr. Jenkins, a portly man with a bald pate and a habit of humming as he worked, looked up from his counter, his spectacles reflecting the glow of a single lamp. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, setting aside a mortar and pestle, "what brings you out in this weather? Not feeling poorly, I hope?" "Not at all, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, her smile warm as she lowered her umbrella. "I'm merely curious about a matter concerning the festival. This dreadful business with Mr. Hawthorne's violin has us all on edge, and I understand a vial of chloroform was found. You wouldn't happen to have sold any recently, would you?" Jenkins's humming stopped, and he adjusted his spectacles, his brow furrowing. "Chloroform, you say? Well now, that's not something I sell every day. It's tightly regulated, you know, for medical use only." He paused, rubbing his chin. "But come to think of it, I did have a gentleman in here a few days ago Monday, I believe asking for a small bottle. Said it was for a medical procedure, Something about calming nerves. I made sure he signed the register, as per the law. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, clicking softly as she began a row. "A gentleman," she said, her tone conversational. "Might you describe him? It could be important." Jenkins frowned, his memory straining. Tallish, well-dressed, with a cultured voice. Wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low in, get a clear look at his face. He was polite, paid in cash, and left quickly. I thought he might be one of the festival folk, but I couldn't swear to it. He shuffled to a drawer and pulled out a ledger, flipping to a page marked with Monday's date. "Here's his signature, P. Smith, though I doubt that's his real name." Looked like a scribble, done in a hurry. Miss Marple peered at the signature, noting the bold, looping strokes, smudged slightly with ink. The smudge reminded her of Bellini's stained fingers, though the handwriting bore no resemblance to the conductor's florid script. "Very helpful, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her eyes crinkling. "And you've seen no one else asking for chloroform? Perhaps Miss Beaumont or Mr. Whitby?" Jenkins shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Miss Beaumont's never been in, and Mr. Whitby only. Buys headache powders, poor man's always fretting. As for that conductor Bellini, he's too busy shouting to bother with my shop." He chuckled, then sobered. "You don't think this has to do with the theft, do you?" "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," Miss Marple said lightly, though her mind was racing. The chloroform was a deliberate choice, requiring not only access but knowledge of its effects. She thanked Jenkins and stepped back into the rain, her thoughts turning to the suspects. Clara's slight frame made her an unlikely candidate for overpowering Hawthorne, and her tearful demeanor suggested no familiarity with chemicals. Bellini's temper was too impulsive for such a methodical act, and his ink stains pointed to writing, not theft. Whitby's debts were a motive, but his nervous caution seemed at odds with the boldness of the attack. Drake, however, with his cultured voice and dark coat, fit the apothecary's vague description, and his interest in the violin's security hinted at deeper intent as she walked toward the village green. Miss Marple considered the chloroform's implications. It required close proximity, perhaps a moment of distraction or trust, suggesting the thief was someone Hawthorne knew. The vial's disposal in the rose bushes, so near the path to the village hall, pointed to a quick escape, possibly toward a familiar place. She recalled the flickering light in the study, seen by Clara's maid, and wondered if it marked the thief's preparation, a lamp left burning to guide their hands at the green. Miss Marple paused, watching festival girls hurry through the rain. The manor's lights were visible across the way, and she pictured the study's chaos, the scattered papers, the overturned chair, the open cigarette case. The chloroform was a new thread, tying the crime to someone with access and cunning. "A planned act," she murmured, but with a personal touch. She resolved to ask Craddock about the vial's exact location and to check Drake's wardrobe for a dark coat, perhaps one recently cleaned to hide traces of garden mud. As she turned toward home, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle, Miss Marple's mind wove together the clues. The chloroform, the footprint, the unforced lock each was a deliberate choice, meant to obscure the truth. "People," she said softly, "think they can hide their traces, but they always leave something behind." Her next step would be to press Drake's alibi further, to see if his charm could withstand closer scrutiny. Chapter 11. The locked cabinet. The rain had softened to a fine mist by the time Miss Jane Marple approached Drake Hall once more, her umbrella folded and her knitting bag nestled under her arm. the theft of the Stradivarius violin and the assault on Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had drawn a net of suspicion around St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was closing in on the truth. The chloroform clue uncovered at the apothecary pointed to a calculated crime, and Lord Percival Drake's polished charm, coupled with his proximity to the manor on the night of the theft, made him a figure of growing interest. The locked cabinet in his study, glimpsed during her earlier visit, lingered in her mind a potential hiding place for secrets, if not the violin itself. With Inspector Craddock's permission, she had arranged to accompany him on a discreet search of Drake's manor, hoping to find a thread that would unravel the mystery. Drake Hall stood imposing against the grey sky, its red brick facade softened by the mist. The butler, as impeccable as before, showed them into the entrance hall, where Lord Drake greeted them with his usual grace, though his blue eyes held a flicker of unease. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, his smile smooth but guarded. "To what do I owe this visit? Surely not more questions about that unfortunate violin." His tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his posture, as if he were bracing for scrutiny. Craddock, his notebook tucked under his arm, was direct. "We're following up on evidence. Lord Drake, we'd like to look around, particularly in your study. Routine, you understand, but we need to be thorough." Drake's smile tightened, but he nodded, gesturing toward the staircase. "Of course, Inspector. I've nothing to hide. My collection is open to view, as Miss Marple can attest." He glanced at her, his eyes searching, but she returned only a mild smile, her knitting needles already clicking as they followed him. To the study, the room was as opulent as Miss Marple remembered, with its polished bookshelves and glass cabinets displaying violins and artifacts. The locked cabinet in the corner, its dark wood unadorned, drew her eye at once. Drake noticed her glance and waved a hand dismissively. "Old papers, as I told you, Miss Marple. Hardly worth your time." His voice was casual, but his fingers brushed the edge of his desk, a small tell of discomfort. Craddock, with a constable in tow, began a methodical search, examining drawers and shelves while Miss Marple lingered near the cabinet. "Might we see inside?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Even old papers can tell a story." Drake hesitated, his charm faltering for a moment. "It's just clutter letters, receipts. But if you insist." He produced a small key from his pocket, unlocking the cabinet with a faint click. Inside were indeed papers, bills, correspondence, a few faded photographs, but Miss Marple's eyes caught a faint dust pattern on the shelf, suggesting something larger had recently been removed. She said nothing, her needles clicking as Craddock sifted through the documents. The constable, meanwhile, opened a wardrobe in the corner, revealing a row of tailored coats and polished shoes. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she spotted a pair of Italian leather shoes, their soles bearing traces of reddish mud that matched the manor's garden. "Those are fine shoes, Lord Drake," she said, her voice light. "Italian, I presume." Drake's smile returned, though it was strained. "Yes, a favourite pair. I wore them to Mrs. Bantry's dinner, though I'm afraid they got a bit muddy in the rain." He glanced at Craddock, who was now examining the shoes, his brow furrowed. "The mud's a match for Hawthorne's garden," Craddock said, his tone neutral but firm. "And these shoes fit the print we found. Can you explain that, Lord Drake?" Drake's eyes flickered, but he shrugged. "I walked near the green that night, as I told you. The paths are muddy this time of year." Surely you don't think I'd leave such an obvious clue if I were the thief." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand. Craddock pressed further. "Your alibi's shaky, sir. Mrs. Bantry says you left her dinner early, around 9:30. That puts you near the manor at the time of the theft." Drake's charm held, but his eyes were cold. "A coincidence, Inspector. I had a headache and needed air. I saw nothing unusual, and I certainly didn't enter Hawthorne's study." Miss Marple's needles paused as she noticed a hidden panel in the cabinet, its edge barely visible. "Might we look behind this?" she asked, her tone innocent. Drake's face paled, but he nodded, stepping aside as Craddock pressed the panel. It sprang open, revealing a velvet-lined compartment, empty but perfectly sized for a violin case. Dust patterns suggested recent use, and a faint scent of polish lingered, as if something had been cleaned and removed. Drake's voice was tight. "That's for a future acquisition. I often store cases there. It proves nothing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Of course," she said, but her mind was racing. The empty compartment, the muddy shoes, the shaky alibis were threads tying Drake to the crime. She recalled the apothecary's description of a well-dressed gentleman buying chloroform, and the flickering light in the study, seen just before 10. Drake's stroll near the manor placed him at the scene, and his collector's passion suggested a motive. As they left the manor, Craddock muttered, "He's hiding something, but we need more than mud and an empty compartment." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the chloroform vial and the unforced lock. "A collector's greed betrays him," she said softly, "but we must find where he's hidden his prize." She resolved to press Mrs. Bantry for more details on Drake's departure and to check with her London contact about his insurance inquiries. The cabinet's secret had tightened the net, but the violin remained out of reach. Chapter 12. The final note. The morning of the music festival's grand finale dawned bright over St. Mary Mead. The village green, alive with banners and the hum of anticipation. Yet the theft of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's Stradivarius violin, the attack on its owner, cast a pall over the festivities, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet resolve, was determined to bring the matter to a close. The clues had woven a tight net around Lord Percival, Drake the muddy Italian shoes, the hidden compartment in his study, the chloroform vial, and his shaky alibi. The violin remained elusive. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, had arranged with Inspector Craddock to gather the suspects one final time in the village hall, where the festival's closing concert was to be held. She intended to unravel the final threads of the mystery before the music began. The hall was a flurry of activity, with musicians tuning instruments and stagehands arranging chairs. The suspects, Maestro Vittorio Bellini, Miss Clara Beaumont, Mr. Ernest Whitby, and Lord Draker, arrived under Craddock's summons, their expressions ranging from irritation to unease. Miss Marple stood near the platform, her black dress blending with the shadows, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed. Bellini's scowl was as fiery as ever, his ink-stained fingers drumming impatiently. Clara clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Whitby adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling, while Drake maintained his polished charm, though his smile was tight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying over the hall's din. "This theft has troubled us all, but I believe we can resolve it here, today. A Stradivarius is no ordinary prize. It draws out passions, and passions reveal truths." She paused, her eyes moving from face to face, noting Bellini's huff, Clara's wince, Whitby's twitch. and Drake's faint frown. She turned to Craddock, who stood ready with his notebook. "The evidence," she said, "tells a clear story. A single muddy footprint in Mr. Hawthorne's study, from an Italian leather shoe, suggested an outsider. Yet the lock on the violin's case was unforced, known only to Mr. Hawthorne and Miss Beaumont. Chloroform subdued the victim, requiring close contact, and a vial was discarded in the rose bushes near the path to this hall. A light flickered in the study before 10, and a figure in a dark coat was seen nearby. These are not accidents, but a carefully staged act." Bellini interrupted, his voice sharp. "Get to the point, Miss Marple. I have a concert to conduct." She smiled faintly. "Undeterred patience, maestro. Let us consider the night of the theft." Miss Beaumont left Mr. Hawthorne at 8, the case locked. Mr. Whitby checked it at 6, finding it secure. Maestro Bellini was here, alone, until midnight. Lord Drake left Mrs. Bantry's dinner early, around 9:30, claiming a headache. He walked near the manor, where a figure was seen. Clara's voice trembled. "I told no one the combination. I swear it." Whitby nodded vigorously. "And I was home, as I said. I saw Lord Drake near the manor, not me." Drake's smile was icy. "You're grasping, Miss Marple." "I admired the violin, yes, but I was at the green, not in the study." Miss Marple. Needles paused. "Admiration can become obsession, Lord Drake. You inquired about the violin's security, visited it often. And your shoes Italian leather bear mud from Hawthorne's garden. Your alibi falters, for Mrs. Bantry confirms. You left early, and a hidden compartment in your study, recently used, fits a violin case perfectly." Drake's face paled, but he held his ground. "Circumstance, not proof. That compartment is for future acquisitions." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps. But my London contact informs me you inquired about insuring a Stradivarius last week before the theft, and the apothecary recalls a well-dressed gentleman, P. Smith, buying chloroform days prior in a dark coat like yours." She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You entered the manor as a guest, used chloroform to subdue Mr. Hawthorne, and opened the case with a combination you'd gleaned perhaps by watching Miss Beaumont at the museum. The footprint was a ruse, left to suggest an outsider, but your shoes betrayed you. You hid the violin, intending to retrieve it later, in a London safe house, I suspect." The hall fell silent, the musicians pausing to listen. Drake's charm crumbled, his eyes darting to the exits. "This is absurd," he stammered. "You've no evidence." Craddock stepped forward, holding the muddy shoes. "These were found in your wardrobe, Lord Drake, and we've a warrant for your London property. Shall we search it?" Drake's shoulders slumped, his voice low. "It's in a safe house, as she says. I couldn't resist. The Stradivarius completed my collection." He sank into a chair, defeated, as Clara gasped, tears spilling. And Bellini muttered about wasted time. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. "Greed, Lord Drake, is a poor composer. It always plays a false note." As Craddock led Drake away, Clara thanked her. Whitby exhaled in relief, and Bellini stormed off to rehearse. Miss Marple left the hall, the festival's music swelling behind her. At her cottage, she settled by the fire, her needles clicking. "People," she murmured, "are so very predictable." The Stradivarius would sing again, and St. Mary Mead would return to its quiet ways.